Let's talk about my story. I grew up in a house where we attended church, but I never understood why. We weren't consistent about it. We didn't really talk about God. I knew a couple of the Bible stories, but in general, I never understood why we did it. Church just didn't make sense. Welcome to the Altered Call podcast. My name is Alex Pillischafske. I want to thank you for joining me on these introductory episodes. I hope that you enjoy this overview of the material coming soon. I've got a friend that calls nature outside church. And as a curious kid growing up in the Midwest, I got a lot of that. It made sense to me that there was a creator. I just didn't know anything about him. Now, the first time that I remember interacting with God is when my dad was diagnosed with cancer. He was diagnosed with a type 3 brain tumor and given a very short time period to live. Now, ultimately, it went into remission for 4 or 5 years, but then it came back and he died about a month before my 12th birthday. Looking back, I know that those 4 or 5 years were a massive blessing for me. But as a kid, I just decided that prayer didn't work. And if this is the type of God that I was dealing with, I was done. I'm not going to do that. So I hardened my heart and I moved on with my life. A couple years later, God decided that he was done with my tantrum and he busted down the doors. My conversion experience was pretty intense. It felt like God was beating me with a 2x4. I was sitting in church and it felt like I was being assaulted. But ultimately it worked. It got my attention, and later on, I got baptized. After I got baptized, I talked to the pastor. I said, look, I believe that this God exists, but what do I do now? He said something to the effect of, I don't know, read your Bible. And I just found that answer to be so deflating. I had just found faith in the God that had created the universe. And what I was supposed to do was read the Bible. Now, I'm not even going to argue that he was wrong. But to a 17-year-old kid whose world had been destroyed and then he was reborn, what is that answer? But I kept going. I believed in God and I was going to do this. Then I went to college, and the student ministry there wasn't any better. They didn't have answers, and it was killing me. And I think that if my story ended there, I would have given up on church. I don't know if I would have given up on God, but I would have given up on church for sure. Fortunately for me, I stumbled upon a student-led prayer group. This was a group of people who were sincerely following God, who were trying to get better, who were trying to please him in the things that they did, and they were trying to understand why he behaved the way that he did. We didn't have all the answers. We probably didn't have any of the answers, but we were trying, and that part made sense to me. If we are Christians, if we do believe these things, we should at least be trying to be different. So I had this new perspective. I had this new perspective of I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and I can actively pursue him. But I had this looming thing over my head. My dad had died at the age of 39. His dad had died at the age of 52. And I was entirely convinced that I would not make it out of my 20s. So I started looking around and trying to figure out what would matter. What could I do with the approximately 10 years of life that I had left? The problem is, I didn't find any answers. I didn't find answers anywhere. It didn't seem like anyone knew what to do with your life. Like there was a general guideline of graduate college, get a job, get married, have kids, retire, die the next day. But that wasn't appealing to me. And let's be honest, from my perspective at that point, I didn't have time. So what actually matters? I couldn't find answers anywhere. And this meant a lot to me. I was looking at everything through the lens of, if I died tomorrow, what would matter? And nobody had the answers. Nobody had the answers to those questions. And I looked at the Christians that I was surrounded by, and they didn't have the answers either. How is it that we have a relationship with the God of the universe and no answers to balance any of this out? It was infuriating to me. Now, after my dad died, I started volunteering with kids. I volunteered with kids a lot, and kids with trauma in really bad situations. So after college, I continued to do that. And I found myself at a youth group. Now, this youth group had a small group tied to it because they knew that they demanded a lot of their volunteers, and this church wanted to make sure that they were pouring back into people. So I joined that group. I remember thinking at the time that this group was one of the healthiest things that I have ever participated in as an adult. It was a bunch of guys sitting around a table, sharing food, and talking about what was actually happening in their life. Not what happened to the church 2,000 years ago, but what was actually happening in their real life and how they would engage with it intentionally. It was in this group that I was given permission to hear God's voice for the first time. I had always been big on prayer, but I had never been given permission to hear him talk back. And this is where I started to develop those skills for the first time. Then, a couple years later, I was given my specific calling. It was 2 words: build men. But I think the way that God developed me in this early part of my life was to give me the gift of perspective, to say, what if this stuff actually matters? And if we believe these things, what do they actually mean? Because believing in God and having that have no impact on the world, that doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't that have an impact in the world? I started asking these questions, but it wasn't until I started hearing God's voice that I started getting any of the answers. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Altered Call podcast. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a review or find links to what I'm doing in the show notes.